The crystal wine glass slipped from my fingers in slow motion, but it didn't shatter when it hit the marble floor of the Bellmont Country Club ballroom. Instead, it bounced once with a hollow ring that seemed to echo through the stunned silence of 250 wedding guests. There, under the cascading white orchids and fairy lights, I'd spent months planning. My younger sister Celeste was pressed against my fiancé Marcus, her emerald green dress hiked up as his hands gripped her waist, their mouths locked together like they were trying to consume each other's souls while everyone I'd ever cared about watched in horrified fascination. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But the glass hitting the floor wasn't what made my heart stop. It wasn't even watching my sister destroy my engagement party with her theatrical display of betrayal. No, what made my blood turn to ice was the manila envelope I was clutching in my other hand. An envelope that contained a DNA test result and a birth certificate that would make this public humiliation look like a gentle summer breeze compared to the hurricane I was about to unleash. Because while everyone in that ballroom was gasping at the sight of my sister stealing my fiancé, they had no idea they were actually watching something far more disturbing. Something that would make this moment legendary in our social circle for all the wrong reasons. Something that would destroy not just my engagement, but my sister's entire world. My name is Victoria Sterling, and I'm 29 years old. I'm a forensic genealogist, which means I trace family trees and uncover genetic connections for legal cases, adoption reunifications, and inheritance disputes. It's a job that's taught me that family secrets always surface eventually, and DNA doesn't lie. Ever. I've spent 7 years building my reputation as the best in Berkshire County, helping people discover their true heritage, and sometimes uncovering truths they wished had stayed buried. But I never imagined I'd use my professional skills to investigate my own family. I never thought I'd spend 3 weeks running genetic analyses, cross-referencing birth records, and following paper trails that led to a truth so devastating it would reshape everything I thought I knew about the people I loved most. To understand why I'm standing here watching my sister commit what amounts to genetic warfare disguised as romantic betrayal, you need to know about the envelope in my hand. You need to know about the late-night phone call I received 6 weeks ago from a woman named Elena Rodriguez, a private investigator who'd been hired by our recently deceased grandfather's estate attorney. You need to know about the safety deposit box that was discovered after grandfather Sterling's funeral. A box that contained documents that shattered everything our family believed about itself. Most importantly, you need to know about the test results I'd been carrying around for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment to address what I'd discovered. Results that revealed Celeste and Derek weren't just betraying me, they were unknowingly committing an act that would horrify them more than it horrified me. You see, while my sister was busy seducing my fiancé with stolen glances and secret text messages she thought I hadn't noticed, I was busy discovering that Derek Hawthorne, the man I'd been planning to marry, the heir to the Hawthorne shipping fortune, the golden boy of Silverhaven's elite society, wasn't who he thought he was. Neither was my sister. The DNA analysis I'd run, using samples I'd collected from both of them during what they thought were innocent family dinners and casual gatherings, revealed a connection that made my stomach turn and my professional ethics scream. A connection that explained why they'd been drawn to each other with an intensity that had always seemed slightly unnatural. A connection that would make their passionate embrace in front of 250 guests look like a scene from a horror movie once the truth came out. Standing there in my custom Vera Wang engagement dress, watching my sister destroy my relationship with theatrical flair, while our guests whispered and pulled out phones to capture the drama, I realized this moment was perfect. Not because I was some mastermind who'd orchestrated this public humiliation, God knows I'd tried to prevent it by confronting them both privately, but because sometimes the universe aligns to deliver justice in the most poetic way possible. Celeste had always been the dramatic one, the sister who commanded attention wherever she went with her platinum blonde hair and model-perfect features. She'd spent our entire childhood being the star while I was the responsible older sister who cleaned up her messes. Even now, at 26, she expected the world to revolve around her desires, never considering the consequences of her actions. Derek had been drawn to that drama, that intensity, like a moth to a flame. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that their attraction wasn't just forbidden because he was my fiancé. It was forbidden for reasons that would make them both physically ill once they understood the truth. As I stood there watching them finally break apart, breathless and defiant, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not heartbreak. I'd already grieved the loss of Derek when I'd discovered their affair 3 weeks ago. Not anger. I'd worked through that during the countless hours I'd spent verifying and re-verifying my research. What I felt was the cold, clinical satisfaction of a scientist about to present findings that would rewrite everything everyone thought they knew. Because in about 30 seconds I was going to transform this engagement party from a simple tale of sibling betrayal into something that would be whispered about in Silverhaven society for generations. I was going to reveal a family secret so explosive that it would make Derek question everything he knew about his identity, and make Celeste understand that some desires come with consequences that extend far beyond broken hearts. The envelope in my hand contained more than just DNA results. It contained the power to turn their moment of triumph into their worst nightmare, and unlike the wine glass that had bounced harmlessly off the marble floor, what I was about to reveal would shatter their entire world beyond repair. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let me back up and properly introduce myself, because understanding who I am and what I do for a living is crucial to understanding how I uncovered the truth that's about to destroy 2 lives in the most spectacular way possible. My name is Victoria Sterling, and I'm 20. For the past 7 years I've built what many consider the most successful forensic genealogy practice on the East Coast. My company, Heritage Investigations, specializes in solving the unsolvable, finding birth parents for adoptees, proving paternity for inheritance cases, identifying victims through DNA when traditional methods fail, and uncovering family connections that people thought were lost forever. I'm the woman prosecutors call when they need to identify a John Doe from a 30-year-old cold case. I'm who adoption agencies contact when they need to reunite families separated by closed adoption. I'm the expert witness who's testified in over 200 court cases, explaining complex genetic relationships to juries who need to understand why DNA evidence proves or disproves family connection. My specialty is taking fragments, a cheek swab, a hair sample, sometimes just genetic material from a decades-old envelope seal, and building complete family trees that reveal connections spanning generations. I've traced bloodlines back 8 generations, connected families across continents, and solved mysteries that have haunted people for their entire lives. But here's what makes my work particularly relevant to this moment. I specialize in cases where people discover that their family isn't who they thought it was. I've delivered news to adoptees that their birth father was their adoptive mother's brother. I've informed clients that the man they thought was their biological father was actually their grandfather. I've revealed affairs, secret adoptions, hidden children, and family structures so complicated they required flowcharts to explain. In short, I'm an expert at uncovering family secrets that people desperately want to keep buried, and I'm very, very good at my job. I'm also someone who believes deeply in the power of truth. My professional motto, printed on every business card and displayed prominently in my office, is DNA doesn't lie, but people do. I've built my reputation on the principle that genetic truth is absolute, unchangeable, and ultimately liberating, even when it's initially devastating. Which is why standing here at my own engagement party holding DNA results that prove my sister and my fiancé are half-siblings, feels like the most twisted case of my career. Because for once, I'm not just the professional delivering life-altering news to strangers. I'm the woman whose own life is about to be turned upside down by the very science I've dedicated my career to mastering. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how we got to this moment, to this envelope, to this revelation, to this public humiliation that's about to become something far worse, you need to know about the phone call that started everything. 6 weeks ago I was working late in my office in downtown Millbrook, reviewing genetic markers for a complex paternity case, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed E. Rodriguez, private investigation. Elena Rodriguez was someone I'd worked with before on particularly sensitive cases where families needed both genetic analysis and traditional detective work to uncover the truth. Victoria, Elena's voice was unusually tight when I answered, I need to see you tonight. It's about your family. Those 5 words, it's about your family, sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the October wind rattling my office windows. In my line of work, when someone says they need to discuss your family, it's never good news. Elena arrived at my office an hour later carrying a sealed banker's box and wearing the expression I'd seen on her face 100 times before when she was about to deliver information that would change someone's life forever, except this time, that someone was, your grandfather's estate attorney hired me 3 weeks ago, she began, setting the box on my desk with unusual care. When they were settling Harold Sterling's final affairs, they discovered a safety deposit box that wasn't listed in his will, a box that had been maintained for over 30 years under a different name. My grandfather had died 4 months earlier at the age of, he'd been the patriarch of our family, a real estate mogul who'd built the Sterling fortune from nothing, and raised my father and his siblings with an iron fist and unwavering moral principles. He'd been the one constant in our family, the man everyone looked up to and respected without question. The box contained documents, Elena continued, including birth certificates, adoption papers, and genetic testing results that your grandfather apparently commissioned in documents that reveal information about your family structure. She paused, choosing her words carefully, that significantly differs from what you've always believed. She opened the box and pulled out a manila folder thick with papers. Victoria, there's no easy way to say that. The testing your grandfather had done, it shows that your father and Derek Hawthorne's father, James Hawthorne, are half-brothers. I stared at her, my professional mind immediately understanding the implications while my personal world started tilting sideways. That's impossible. The Hawthornes and the Sterlings have been family friends for generations, but we're not related. Derek and I have been together for 2 years. If there was a family connection, someone would have mentioned it. Elena shook her head grimly. That's exactly what your grandfather was trying to prevent. According to these documents, your grandmother had an affair with James Hawthorne Sr. in Derek's grandfather. Your father was born 9 months later, but your grandfather claimed him as his own, and swore everyone involved to secrecy. The room seemed to spin, as the implications hit me. If my father and Derek's father were half-brothers, that made Derek my half-cousin. More importantly, it made Derek and Celeste half-cousins as well. There's more, Elena said quietly. Your grandfather continued monitoring the Hawthorne family line through the years. When Derek was born, he had genetic testing done to confirm the relationship. These results, she tapped the folder, prove beyond any doubt that Derek Hawthorne is your family. Specifically, he's your half-cousin. I sat in stunned silence, my professional training warring with my personal shock. This was exactly the kind of family secret I'd uncovered dozens of times for other people, but experiencing it myself was entirely different. Why are you telling me this now? I finally asked. Elena's expression grew even more serious. Because 3 days ago, I received a tip that Derek and your sister have been having an affair. The person who hired me to investigate your grandfather's documents specifically requested that I monitor both families for any inappropriate relationships that might develop. That's when I realized someone had been playing a very long game, and I was about to discover just how deep this family secret really went. To understand how devastating this revelation truly was, you need to know about the complex web of relationships that had shaped our families for decades. The Sterlings and the Hawthornes weren't just neighbors or business associates. We were woven into each other's lives so deeply that the idea of a hidden blood connection seemed absolutely impossible. My sister Celeste and I had grown up in the sprawling Sterling estate in Willowbrook Heights, the most exclusive neighborhood in our county. Our childhood was spent attending the same elite private schools, the same country club events, and the same charity galas as the Hawthorne children. Derek was exactly 3 years older than me, which meant he'd been a constant presence throughout my formative years, the older boy who'd taught me to sail at the yacht club, who'd partnered with me at cotillion dance lesson, who'd been my first kiss at 16 during a New Year's Eve party at his family's mansion. Our families had always joked about how perfect it would be if Derek and I ended up together. Joining the Sterling and Hawthorne dynasties, my father would say with a laugh whenever anyone mentioned our close friendship, Little did we know how prophetic and horrifying that statement would become. But the relationship dynamics in our family had always been complicated, and Celeste had always been at the center of that complication. She was born when I was 3 years old, and from the moment she arrived, it was clear that she possessed something I didn't, an almost supernatural ability to charm every person she encountered. While I was serious, studious, and quietly determined to prove myself through achievement, Celeste was radiant, spontaneous, and effortlessly magnetic. Our parents, David and Catherine Sterling, handled our differences in ways that shaped both of our personalities permanently. I was the responsible one who could be trusted with important tasks, given independence, and expected to excel without much supervision. Celeste was the special one who needed extra attention, extra forgiveness, and extra protection from the consequences of her choice. When Celeste was 8 and stole a diamond bracelet from a family friend's house during a dinner party, our parents quietly returned it and made excuses about her not understanding boundaries yet. When she was 16 and crashed my father's vintage Porsche while joyriding with friends, they bought her a new BMW and told everyone the accident was my fault for not watching out for her. When she was 22 and dropped out of law school 3 months before graduation to find herself in Europe for 6 months, they funded her soul-searching expedition and told the family she was taking a sabbatical for her mental health. Meanwhile, when I was 17 and received a B+ instead of an A in AP Chemistry, I was grounded for a month and told I was not living up to my potential. When I asked for help with college tuition, I was informed that taking out student loans would build character. When I started my forensic genealogy business, I was given exactly one piece of advice: don't embarrass the family name by failing. This dynamic had created a relationship between Celeste and me that was equal parts love and resentment. I adored my sister. Her laugh could light up any room, her creativity was genuinely inspiring, and her ability to make friends everywhere she went was something I'd always envied. But I also spent most of my childhood and adolescence cleaning up her messes, covering for her mistakes, and watching our parents excuse behavior that would have gotten me disowned. Derek had witnessed this dynamic throughout our shared childhood, and I'd always appreciated that he seemed to see both of us clearly. He never fell for Celeste's manipulation tactics the way most men did. He never made me feel like the boring, responsible sister by comparison. When we started dating 2 years ago, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. We already knew each other's histories, understood each other's families, and shared the same social circle. Or so I thought. What I didn't realize was that Derek had been watching Celeste just as carefully as he'd been watching me, but for entirely different reasons. While I saw his immunity to her charms as evidence of his maturity and commitment to me, he was apparently developing a fascination that had nothing to do with immunity and everything to do with forbidden attraction. The signs had been there for months, but I'd explained them away because I trusted both of them completely. Derek's sudden interest in attending family dinners that he'd previously found boring, his questions about Celeste's dating life that seemed more thorough than brotherly concern warranted, the way he'd linger after family gatherings, always finding reasons to stay until Celeste came home from whatever social event she'd been attending. Celeste, for her part, had always been flirtatious with everyone. It was simply her nature. She flirted with waiters, professors, married men, gay men, and elderly gentlemen with equal enthusiasm because she craved attention the way other people craved oxygen. So when she started touching Derek's arm during conversations, laughing at his jokes a little too loudly, and finding excuses to wear increasingly revealing outfits to family events, I dismissed it as typical Celeste behavior. I should have recognized the pattern. I should have seen that this was different from her usual scattered flirtation. This was focused, intentional, and escalating in ways that her casual charm offensive never did. But I was distracted by my own life. My business was exploding with new clients, I was testifying in high-profile court cases, and I was planning what I thought would be the perfect wedding to the man I'd loved since I was 16. I was also dealing with the grief of losing my grandfather, the stress of managing his estate, and the overwhelming responsibility of organizing an engagement party for 250 people. Most importantly, I was blind to what was happening because I trusted them. Not naively, I wasn't some innocent who believed people were incapable of betrayal. In my line of work, I'd seen every possible variation of family deception and romantic infidelity. I knew better than most people how easily love could turn to lies and how quickly trust could be shattered. But Derek and Celeste were different. They were my people. They were family. They were the two individuals in the world who I believed would never ever hurt me because they loved me too much to destroy what we'd built together. That trust, I was beginning to realize, had been my greatest weakness and their greatest weapon. While I was working late nights building my career and planning our future, they were building something else entirely, something that would have been nearly devastating if it were just an affair between my sister and my fiancé. But with the DNA results Elena had shown me, I now knew it was something far worse. They weren't just betraying me, they were betraying basic human boundaries that existed for reasons coded into our very genetics, and the most twisted part was that they had no idea what they were actually doing to each other. As I stood there at my engagement party watching them grope each other in front of our extended families and social circle, I realized that the next few minutes weren't just going to destroy my relationship and humiliate my sister, they were going to reveal a family secret that would redefine everything everyone thought they knew about the Sterling and Hawthorne legacy. And unlike the countless times I'd delivered devastating genetic news to other families, this time I was going to have a front row seat to watch how people react when they discover that love and attraction can be genetically programmed in the most disturbing ways possible. Derek Hawthorne entered my romantic life officially 2 years ago at the Midsummer Charity Gala, though he'd been orbiting the edges of my world for my entire existence. What I didn't know at the time was that his decision to pursue me wasn't the natural evolution of a childhood friendship that I'd always believed it to be. According to the documents Elena had shown me, Derek's interest in our family had been deliberately cultivated by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The gala was held at the Grandview Manor, the same venue where we were now having our engagement party, and Derek had approached me while I was standing alone on the terrace, escaping the suffocating small talk inside. He looked devastatingly handsome in his black tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly styled, his green eyes reflecting the string lights that had been wound around the garden trees. "Victoria Sterling," he'd said, appearing beside me with 2 glasses of champagne, "the woman who's too busy changing the world to dance with old friends." I'd laughed, accepting the champagne and feeling that familiar flutter I'd experienced around him since we were teenagers. "Derek Hawthorne, the man who's too charming for his own good. Dance with me," he'd said, extending his hand. "Just once. For old time's sake." That dance had led to dinner the following week. Dinner had led to a weekend sailing trip. The sailing trip had led to 6 months of the most intense, passionate relationship I'd ever experienced. Derek was everything I'd dreamed of in a partner, intelligent enough to challenge me professionally, successful enough to understand the demands of building a business empire, and connected enough to our shared social world that dating him felt like coming home. But looking back now, with the benefit of Elena's revelations, I could see the calculation behind his romantic pursuit. The way he'd asked detailed questions about my work that seemed like genuine interest but were actually intelligence gathering. How he'd encouraged me to talk about my family history, particularly my grandfather's business dealings and personal relationships. The subtle way he'd steered conversations toward genetics and family traits, always under the guise of intellectual curiosity about my profession. Most tellingly, he'd been fascinated by Celeste from the very beginning of our relationship. Not in the obvious way that most men were fascinated by her, not with the slack-jawed appreciation for her beauty or the desperate attempts to win her attention. Derek's interest in my sister was more sophisticated, more patient. He studied her the way a scientist studies a particularly intriguing specimen. "Your sister is remarkable," he'd said after our first family dinner together. "There's something almost hypnotic about her energy." I'd been pleased by his observation, interpreting it as appreciation for someone I loved rather than recognition of something I should have been worried about. "Celeste has always had that effect on people," I'd agreed. "She lights up every room she enters." "It's more than that," Derek had continued, his eyes distant in a way that should have triggered my professional instincts. "There's something familiar about her, like I've known her forever, even though we've barely spent time together." That conversation had taken place 18 months ago, and I dismissed his comment as the natural result of growing up in the same social circle. Now I understood he'd been responding to something much more primal and disturbing, a genetic recognition that neither of them consciously understood, but both of them felt on a cellular level. The courtship phase of our relationship had been everything a woman could want. Derek was attentive without being clingy, romantic without being overly sentimental, and ambitious in ways that complemented rather than competed with my own goals. He'd supported my business expansion, celebrated my professional victories, and seamlessly integrated into my daily routine, but he'd also systematically positioned himself as a regular presence in my family's life. He'd volunteered to help with my grandfather's estate planning, offering his business expertise for financial decisions that didn't really require his input. He'd started attending Sterling family events that he'd previously avoided, always with reasonable explanations about wanting to be more involved with my relative. Most significantly, he'd developed an almost protective interest in Celeste's welfare that had seemed touching at the time, but now appeared far more sinister. When Celeste had gone through a bad breakup 6 months ago, Derek had been the one to suggest she needed family support and had encouraged me to invite her to stay at my apartment for as long as she needed. When she'd mentioned struggling with her career direction, he'd been the one to recommend she explore opportunities in Millbrook rather than moving back to Los Angeles. Families should stick together, he'd said whenever I'd expressed concern about enabling Celeste's dependence, especially siblings who care about each other as much as you two do. Looking back, I could see how he'd been orchestrating opportunities for them to spend time together. Business dinners that he'd suggest Celeste join so she won't be alone. Weekend trips that he'd recommend we invite her on, because she needs cheering up. Social events where he'd encourage me to bring her along because she knows so many interesting people. I'd thought he was being thoughtful about my relationship with my sister. Instead, he'd been systematically creating scenarios where he could observe and interact with her without raising suspicions about his motivations. The most chilling realization was that Derek's romantic pursuit of me might have been a cover for his real interest from the very beginning. According to the timeline Elena had shown me, Derek's father had received a mysterious inheritance from an anonymous benefactor around the same time Derek had started dating me, an inheritance that had come with specific instructions about maintaining family connections and ensuring the next generation understands their true heritage. Someone had been playing a very long game with our families, and Derek had either been a willing participant or an unwitting pawn in a plan that involved bringing him into close contact with both Sterling's sisters. The question that haunted me was whether he'd known about the genetic connection when he'd started pursuing me, or whether he'd discovered it later and decided to act on his feelings for Celeste regardless of the biological implication. Either scenario was deeply disturbing, but for different reasons. If he'd known from the beginning, then our entire relationship had been built on a lie designed to position him near my sister. If he'd discovered it later, then he'd made a conscious choice to pursue a relationship that violated every natural boundary that should exist between family members. But the most twisted aspect of the whole situation was that Celeste seemed to be responding to Derek with an intensity that defied her usual pattern of casual flirtation. My sister typically grew bored with men within weeks of meeting them. She enjoyed the chase, the conquest, and the validation, but she'd never sustained genuine interest in anyone long enough for a real relationship to develop. With Derek, everything was different. She'd been pursuing him with a single-minded determination that was completely unlike her usual scattered romantic attention. She'd changed her schedule to coincide with his visits, altered her appearance to appeal to his preferences, and focused her considerable charm on winning him away from me with a persistence that suggested something much deeper than simple sibling rivalry. The genetic counselor in me understood exactly what was happening. They were responding to biological signals that they couldn't consciously identify but couldn't resist. The attraction they felt for each other wasn't just forbidden because of their relationships to me. It was forbidden because their DNA was programmed to recognize each other as family members who should never ever be romantically involved. Standing there watching them kiss in front of 250 guests, I realized that Derek's entrance into my life 2 years ago hadn't been the beginning of our love story. It had been the beginning of a genetic horror story that someone had been orchestrating for decades, and I was about to be the one to reveal just how deep the manipulation really went. The first real warning sign came 3 months ago during what should have been a routine family dinner at the Sterling estate. I was running late from a client meeting, and when I arrived I found Derek and Celeste alone in my father's study, standing closer together than the conversation they claimed to be having would have warranted. "We were just looking at the family photos," Celeste had said, her cheeks flushed in a way that had nothing to do with the warmth of the room. Derek was asking about grandfather's business partner. Derek had stepped away from her with what seemed like reluctance, his hand lingering on her lower back for just a moment too long before he moved to greet me. "Your sister has such fascinating insights about your family's history," he'd said, his voice carrying an undertone I couldn't quite identify. At the time I'd been pleased that they were getting along so well. Celeste had always been politely distant with my previous boyfriends, treating them like temporary fixtures she didn't need to invest energy in understanding. Her genuine interest in Derek felt like validation of my choice in partner. But as the weeks passed, I started noticing patterns that made my professional instincts twitch with unease. Derek began arriving early for every family gathering, always with some reasonable excuse about wanting to help with preparations or discuss business matters with my father. Without fail, these early arrivals coincided with times when I was still at the office and Celeste was already home. My sister, who had never shown interest in punctuality for anything in her life, suddenly started arriving precisely on time for every event where Derek would be present. She'd appear in carefully chosen outfits that somehow managed to be both appropriate for family dinners and subtly provocative in ways that seemed designed to capture and hold masculine attention. The conversations between them developed an intensity that made everyone else in the room feel like observers rather than participants. They'd start discussing something innocuous, a news article, a mutual acquaintance, a piece of art in my parents' collection, and within minutes they'd be leaning toward each other, speaking in lowered voices, sharing private smiles that excluded everyone else present. "They certainly have a lot to talk about," my mother had mentioned after one particularly charged dinner conversation. "It's wonderful that Derek appreciates Celeste's perspective on things." But I was beginning to recognize that their conversations had the electric quality of verbal foreplay rather than familial bonding. They weren't discussing ideas, they were engaging in an elaborate mating dance disguised as intellectual discourse. The touching started subtly, a hand on her shoulder when Derek moved past Celeste's chair, her fingers brushing his when she passed him a drink. Brief contacts that could easily be explained as accidental but happened with increasing frequency and duration. During my engagement party planning, Derek had volunteered to help with vendor coordination, which had required several meetings at my apartment. Celeste had started appearing at these planning sessions uninvited, always with some excuse about wanting to contribute to the preparations or needing to discuss family guest list detail. "I just want everything to be perfect for you," she'd said when I gently suggested that the planning meetings might be more efficient with fewer people involved. "Derek has such excellent taste, and I want to make sure we're creating something that reflects how special your relationship is." The irony of her statement was lost on me at the time, but the planning sessions had become exercises in watching Derek and Celeste find ways to work together on tasks that required them to stand close, lean over the same document, and coordinate their movements in ways that seemed designed to maximize physical proximity. Then came the text message incident that should have shattered my denial immediately. I'd borrowed Derek's phone to call the caterer when mine had died during a planning session, and I'd seen a message notification from Celeste that made my blood run cold. "Can't stop thinking about yesterday. When can we be alone again?" When I'd confronted Derek about the message, he'd had an explanation ready that was both plausible and unsatisfying. "She's been struggling with some personal issues, and I've been giving her advice about a situation with one of her friends." The alone comment refers to having a private conversation where she can speak freely without worrying about family members overhearing and getting involved in her friend's drama. Celeste had corroborated this story when I'd asked her about it directly, providing details about a fictional friend's relationship problems that were elaborate enough to be convincing but vague enough to be unverifiable. They'd clearly coordinated their explanation, which should have been the biggest red flag of all, but I'd wanted to believe them so desperately that I'd accepted their story. The professional side of my brain had been screaming warnings for weeks, but the personal side had been drowning out those warnings with rationalization. I'd seen this exact pattern in dozens of my cases, family members developing inappropriate relationships while the people around them explained away increasingly obvious signs of trouble. I'd testified in court about cases where adoptees had unknowingly married their biological siblings, where family members had engaged in relationships that violated genetic boundaries they didn't know existed. I'd explained to juries how genetic sexual attraction was a documented phenomenon that could occur when closely related individuals met as adults without knowing their biological connection. But somehow I'd failed to apply my professional knowledge to my own situation, even as the evidence mounted that Derek and Celeste were exhibiting every classic sign of people struggling with forbidden attraction they couldn't understand or control. The breaking point had come 2 weeks ago during a weekend at the Hawthorne family lake house. Derek had invited our entire family for what was supposed to be a relaxing getaway before the stress of final wedding preparation. The house was large enough that everyone had their own space, but the common areas were designed to encourage group interaction. I'd woken up early on Saturday morning to find Derek and Celeste on the dock together, sitting so close their legs were touching, engaged in what appeared to be an intensely emotional conversation. When they'd seen me approaching, they'd moved apart with obvious reluctance, and both had spent the rest of the day avoiding being alone together while simultaneously seeking opportunities to make eye contact across crowded rooms. That evening, I'd found Celeste crying in her bedroom, claiming she was confused about feelings she shouldn't be having. When I'd pressed her for details, she'd insisted it was about someone who's completely wrong for her but impossible to forget. Derek had been equally strange that weekend, alternating between periods of intense focus on me and moments of obvious distraction where he'd stare off into space with an expression of longing that made my stomach turn. He'd been affectionate to the point of overcompensation, constantly touching me, complimenting me and making elaborate declarations of love that felt more like attempts to convince himself than expressions of genuine emotion. The final piece of evidence had come just days before our engagement party, when I'd arrived home unexpectedly early from a client meeting to find Derek's car in my driveway and voices coming from my living room. I'd entered quietly planning to surprise them, and had instead overheard a conversation that made my blood freeze. "This has to stop," Derek was saying, his voice thick with emotion. "What we're feeling, it's not right. Victoria doesn't deserve this." "I know," Celeste had replied, and I could hear tears in her voice. "But I can't help how I feel when I'm near you. It's like something chemical, something I can't control." "I feel it too," Derek had admitted. "But we can't act on it. We can't destroy her life because we can't understand what's happening to us." I'd retreated to my car and driven around for an hour trying to process what I'd heard and decide how to handle the situation. By the time I'd returned home, Derek was gone, and Celeste was in her room with the door closed, claiming she had a headache. That conversation had confirmed what my professional instincts had been telling me for weeks. They were struggling with an attraction they couldn't explain or control, and they were both fighting against it out of loyalty to me. But it had also revealed something more disturbing. They had no idea why they felt such intense chemistry, which meant they had no idea that their attraction was rooted in genetic recognition that should have been a warning rather than an invitation. Standing there at my engagement party, watching them finally give in to feelings they'd been battling for months, I realized that the envelope in my hand contained more than just DNA results. It contained the explanation for behavior that had been torturing all three of us, and the key to understanding how a love triangle had become a genetic nightmare that none of us had seen coming. The moment Derek and Celeste finally broke apart from their passionate kiss, the ballroom at Bellmont Country Club had fallen into the kind of silence that only occurs when twin simultaneously witness something so shocking that their brains need time to process what they've just seen. The only sounds were the soft jazz music still playing from the band, and the barely audible whisper of phones being pulled from purses and pockets, to capture what everyone knew would become the most talked-about scandal in Silverhaven society history. Derek's face was a canvas of conflicting emotions: relief, guilt, defiance, and something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled from Celeste's fingers, his bow tie was askew, and there was a smear of her ruby-red lipstick across his mouth that he seemed in no hurry to wipe away. For a man who had just publicly humiliated his fiancée at their own engagement party, he looked remarkably at peace with his choices. Celeste, meanwhile, was glowing with the kind of triumphant energy she typically reserved for moments when she'd successfully manipulated a situation to her advantage. Her emerald dress, which I now realized she'd chosen specifically because it was Derek's favorite color, was perfectly arranged despite their passionate embrace. Her platinum blonde hair cascaded over her shoulders in deliberate disarray, and her green eyes sparkled with vindictive pleasure as she surveyed the shocked faces of our guests. "Well," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom, "I suppose the cat's out of the bag now." Derek moved closer to her, his arm sliding possessively around her waist in a gesture that sent a collective gasp through the crowd. "We didn't plan for it to happen this way," he said, addressing the room but looking directly at me, "but we can't deny what we feel any longer." My parents stood frozen near the head table, my father's face purple with rage, while my mother clutched her pearls with the kind of death grip usually reserved for natural disaster. The Hawthorne family was equally stunned, Derek's mother holding onto his father's arm as if she might collapse from shock. "Victoria," Derek continued, finally having the courtesy to use my name while destroying my life, "you're an amazing woman, but what Celeste and I, it's something neither of us has ever experienced before. It's like we were meant to find each other." The cosmic irony of his statement would have been hilarious if it weren't so deeply disturbing. They were meant to find each other, just not in the way he imagined. They were meant to recognize each other as family members who should maintain appropriate boundaries, not as potential lovers whose attraction defied social convention. Celeste stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor with the confidence of someone who believed she'd just won the greatest victory of her life. "I know this looks terrible," she said, her voice carrying the practiced sincerity she'd perfected during years of talking her way out of consequences. "But sometimes love doesn't follow the rules we think it should follow." "Love?" I said, speaking for the first time since dropping my wine glass. My voice sounded unnaturally calm, even to my own ears. "Is that what you're calling this?" Derek's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. He'd clearly expected tears, screaming, or some kind of emotional breakdown that would allow him to position himself as the reluctant participant in a love story too powerful to resist. My composed response was obviously not part of the script he'd prepared. "Victoria, please try to understand," he said, taking a step toward me. "Neither of us wanted to hurt you. We fought against these feelings for months. But there's something between us that's impossible to ignore. Something chemical," I said, remembering the conversation I'd overheard. "Something you can't control." Celeste nodded eagerly, apparently interpreting my calm tone as a sign that I might be willing to accept their explanation. "Exactly. It's like we're drawn to each other on a level that goes beyond normal attraction. Like we're connected in some way that's deeper than anything either of us has experienced before." The guests were beginning to murmur among themselves. Phones were openly recording now, and I could see several people already typing furiously on their devices, no doubt sharing the unfolding drama with friends who hadn't been invited to witness it firsthand. By tomorrow morning, this moment would be dissected on every social media platform and discussed in every social circle from Silverhaven to the state capitol. My best friend Olivia had appeared at my side, her face a mask of fury as she glared at Derek and Celeste. "Victoria, let's get you out of here," she whispered urgently. "You don't need to stand here and listen to this." But I shook my head, my hand tightening around the manila envelope that contained the information that would transform this public humiliation into something far more devastating for both of them. "No," I said quietly. "I think everyone should hear what they have to say." Derek looked relieved by my apparent willingness to let them explain themselves. "I know this is shocking," he said, addressing the crowd with the kind of confidence that suggested he'd rehearsed this moment. "But sometimes life takes unexpected turns. What Celeste and I discovered is that love doesn't always follow conventional paths. We tried to stay away from each other," Celeste added, her voice taking on the breathless quality she used when she wanted to appear vulnerable and sympathetic. "We knew how this would look, how it would hurt people we care about. But fighting these feelings was making us both miserable. So you decided to act on them," I said, my tone still unnaturally steady. "Tonight, at my engagement party." infern of my family and friends. Derek had the grace to look slightly ashamed. We didn't plan for it to happen here. But when we were dancing earlier, something just clicked, like a switch being flipped. We couldn't pretend anymore. The dancing, I repeated, thinking about how I'd seen them together on the dance floor 20 minutes ago, moving together with an intimacy that had made several guests uncomfortable. When exactly did this enlightenment occur? Celeste glanced at Derek, and I saw a moment of silent communication pass between them. When the band played The Way You Look Tonight, she said. We were dancing, and Derek said something that made me laugh, and when I looked up at him, she trailed off with a dreamy expression that would have been romantic if it weren't so completely inappropriate. And you realized you couldn't live without each other, I finished for her. Yes, Derek said, his arm tightening around Celeste's waist. I know it sounds crazy, but it felt like everything suddenly made sense. Like we'd been fighting against something that was meant to be. The phrase meant to be hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Around us, the guests were beginning to show signs of restlessness. Some moving toward the exits, others clustering together in small groups to whisper about what they'd witnessed. The photographers I'd hired to capture my perfect engagement party were now documenting the most spectacular relationship implosion in recent social history. Well, I said, finally allowing a smile to cross my face, since we're all here together, and since you've shared your truth with everyone, I think it's only fair that I share something as well. Derek's expression shifted from confident to wary. Victoria, what are you talking about? I held up the manila envelope, making sure everyone in the room could see it. I'm talking about the DNA test results that explain exactly why you two feel such an irresistible connection to each other. The color drained from both of their faces as the implications of my words began to sink in. Around us, the murmuring of the guests grew louder, as people began to understand that the evening's entertainment was far from over. DNA test? Celeste's voice was barely above a whisper. Oh yes, I said, my professional demeanor finally taking over completely. The test that reveals exactly what kind of connection you two have been feeling. The kind that explains why your attraction feels so chemical, so impossible to resist, so unlike anything either of you has experienced before. Derek's hand dropped from Celeste's waist as if he'd been burned. What are you saying? I'm saying, I replied, opening the envelope with deliberate care, that what you two think is love is actually something much more disturbing, and everyone here is about to learn exactly what happens when genetic sexual attraction meets family secrets that have been buried for over 30 years. The transformation that came over me in that moment was something I'd experienced hundreds of times in courtrooms and client meetings, but never in my personal life. It was the shift from emotional human being to clinical professional, from wounded woman to expert witness, about to present evidence that would redefine everything everyone thought they understood about the situation unfolding before them. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, my voice carrying the authoritative tone I used when addressing juries. I realize this evening has taken an unexpected turn, but I think what happens next will be educational for everyone present. The murmuring in the crowd died down as people sensed that something significant was about to be revealed. Derek and Celeste stood frozen, their previous confidence evaporating as they began to comprehend that their moment of triumph was about to become something else entirely. Victoria, Derek said, his voice tight with growing anxiety. Whatever you think you know. Oh, I don't think I know anything, I interrupted smoothly. I have scientific proof, which, as someone who's spent 7 years building a career on genetic analysis, I find far more reliable than feelings or intuition. I moved to the center of the dance floor, positioning myself where everyone could see and hear me clearly. The photographer who had been documenting our engagement party had instinctively shifted into professional mode, capturing what he seemed to understand was a historically significant moment. My profession, I continued, involves revealing family connections that people don't know exist. I've reunited adoptees with birth families, identified remains through DNA analysis, and solved paternity cases that have shaped inheritance disputes worth millions of dollars. But tonight I get to demonstrate my expertise on a case that's particularly close to home. Celeste took a step backward, her face pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. Victoria, Stop. You're scaring people. Am I? I asked, genuinely curious, because I think what I'm about to share will actually answer some questions that several people in this room have been wondering about for a very long time. My father moved closer to the dance floor, his business instincts apparently overriding his personal shock. He'd built his fortune by understanding when situations were about to shift dramatically, and he clearly sensed that whatever I was about to reveal would have implications beyond simple family drama. The Sterling and Hawthorne families, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the now silent ballroom, have been connected for generations through business partnerships, social relationships, and shared community involvement. What most people don't know is that we've also been connected through blood relationships that were deliberately hidden from public knowledge. James Hawthorne, Derek's father, stepped forward with an expression of growing alarm. Victoria, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but Mr. Hawthorne, I said, turning to face him directly, I've discovered exactly what my grandfather Harold Sterling documented in his private safety deposit box before his death, including the genetic testing he commissioned in 1987 to confirm suspicions he'd harbored for over 20 years. The mention of my grandfather's name sent a visible shock through several of the older guests, particularly the Hawthorne family member. Derek's mother gripped her husband's arm with white knuckles, and I saw Derek's grandfather, who was 91 and rarely attended social events, suddenly straighten in his wheelchair with an expression of absolute terror. What my grandfather discovered, I continued, opening the manila envelope with deliberate ceremony, was that his wife, my grandmother Catherine Sterling, had engaged in an extramarital affair in 1962 with James Hawthorne Sr., Derek's grandfather. The gasp that went up from the crowd was audible even over the soft jazz music that was still playing, creating a surreal soundtrack to the unfolding genetic drama. Derek's grandfather attempted to speak, but no sound emerged from his mouth. The result of that affair, I said, pulling out the first document from the envelope, was the birth of my father David Sterling, in 1963, a child who was claimed and raised by Harold Sterling but who was, genetically speaking, the son of James Hawthorne Sr. My father's face went through a series of expressions: shock, denial, understanding, and finally a kind of resigned acceptance that suggested this revelation explained things about his own life that had never quite made sense. Which means, I continued, my voice taking on the educational tone I used when explaining complex genetic relationships to people who weren't familiar with the science, that my father and Derek's father are half-brothers, making Derek and myself half-cousins. Derek's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his brain clearly struggling to process the implications of what I'd just revealed. Celeste swayed slightly on her feet, her face now completely drained of color. But the truly fascinating part, I said, warming to my subject as I always did when discussing genetic relationships, is what this means about the intense attraction that Derek and Celeste have been experiencing. I pulled out a second document, this one bearing the letterhead of a prestigious genetic testing laboratory. This is a DNA analysis I commissioned 3 weeks ago, using samples I collected from both Derek and Celeste during recent family gatherings. You tested our DNA. Celeste's voice was barely above a whisper. I tested your DNA, I confirmed, because when Derek started asking so many questions about our family history, and when you two began exhibiting the classic signs of what genetic sexual attraction, I felt it was my professional responsibility to investigate whether there might be a biological explanation for your behavior. The term genetic sexual attraction sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd, though I could see that most people didn't understand its implications yet. The results, I said, holding up the laboratory report so everyone could see the official seal, confirm that Derek Hawthorne and Celeste Sterling are half-cousins, sharing 12.5% of their DNA through their grandfather's bloodline. Derek actually staggered backward, his hand reaching for something to steady himself. That's impossible. We can't be related. Our families have been friends forever. But we're not. You're not what, Derek? I asked gently. You're not attracted to each other in a way that feels different from anything you've experienced before. You don't feel a connection that seems almost magnetic, almost inevitable. Celeste made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a retch. Oh God, what have we done? What you've done, I said, my voice taking on the clinical detachment I used when delivering difficult news to clients, is respond to genetic recognition signals that your brains interpreted as sexual attraction rather than familial identification. It's a documented phenomenon that occurs when closely related individuals meet as adults without knowing their biological connection. The crowd was now completely silent, except for the soft sound of people breathing and the occasional whisper of fabric as someone shifted their weight. Every phone in the room was pointed in our direction, capturing what would undoubtedly become the most widely shared social media content in Silverhaven history. The reason your attraction feels so chemical, so irresistible, I continued, is because it is chemical. Your brains are responding to shared genetic markers that signal biological relatedness. Unfortunately, when people don't know they're related, those same chemical signals can be misinterpreted as romantic compatibility. Derek's legs seemed to give out, and he sank into a nearby chair with his head in his hands. This can't be happening. This can't be real. It's absolutely real, I said, my voice remaining steady and professional despite the emotional devastation I was witnessing. And it explains why you've both been fighting feelings that seemed impossible to control. Your brains were trying to tell you something important about your relationship, but you misunderstood the message. Celeste was now openly crying, mascara streaming down her cheeks as the full horror of the situation began to sink in. We're related. We're actually related. And oh God, we kissed. You've been responding to biological programming that exists to help family members recognize each other, I finished for her. It's not your fault that you misinterpreted those signals, but it is important that you understand what they actually mean. The ballroom had taken on the atmosphere of a courtroom where a particularly shocking piece of evidence had just been presented. People were staring at Derek and Celeste with expressions ranging from horror to fascination to sympathetic understanding. But I wasn't finished yet. The DNA results were just the beginning of what I had to reveal. The silence in the ballroom stretched for what felt like an eternity as Derek and Celeste grappled with the horrifying reality of what they'd just learned. But I could see in their faces that they were beginning to hope this was the extent of the revelation, that discovering they were half-cousins was the worst news they would receive tonight. They had no idea that the genetic connection was only the foundation of a much larger and more sinister truth. Now, I said, my voice cutting through the shocked silence like a scalpel through skin, I imagine some of you are wondering how such a significant family secret could have remained hidden for over 60 years. The answer to that question reveals something far more disturbing than a simple extramarital affair. I reached into the envelope and withdrew a thick stack of documents bound with a red ribbon, the contents of my grandfather's secret safety deposit box. These papers document a conspiracy that spans 3 generations and involves people in this room who have been actively working to manipulate the genetic destiny of both our families. Derek's head snapped up from his hands, his eyes focusing on me with growing alarm. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that your relationship with me and your attraction to Celeste were not accidents or coincidences, I said, my voice taking on the cold precision I used when presenting the most damning evidence in court cases. They were the intended results of a decades-long breeding experiment designed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that the evening's revelations were far from over. I could see my parents' faces in my peripheral vision, both of them looking like they were bracing for impact from an explosion they could sense was coming, but couldn't yet comprehend. Elena Rodriguez, the private investigator who brought me these documents, discovered that my grandfather Harold Sterling received monthly payments from an anonymous trust fund for over 30 years. I continued, holding up bank statements that documented the financial payments that were specifically designated for genetic monitoring and family guidance services. James Hawthorne, Derek's father, stepped forward with an expression of growing desperation. Hawthorne, I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to silence him immediately. I think you know exactly what these payments were for, because according to these records your family received identical payments from the same trust fund. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Derek's mother grabbed her husband's arm, her face white with terror, while Derek's grandfather seemed to be having some kind of medical episode in his wheelchair. The trust fund, I said, pulling out incorporation documents that Elena had traced through multiple shell companies, was established in 1963 by a consortium of families involved in what they called genetic optimization research that was being conducted on their own descendants without their knowledge or consent. That's insane, Celeste whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Something in my tone was making it clear that whatever I was about to reveal was supported by undeniable evidence. Is it insane? I asked, turning to face the crowd with the confidence of someone who had spent weeks verifying every detail of what they were about to present, because according to these documents, the consortium was specifically interested in what would happen if children from the Sterling Hawthorne bloodline were raised separately and then brought together as adults. I held up a research proposal dated 1965. Its pages yellowed with age, but its typewritten text still clearly legible. This document outlines a multi-generational study designed to test whether genetic sexual attraction could be deliberately triggered and controlled through strategic family engineering. Derek struggled to his feet, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. You're saying someone planned that? Someone wanted us to be attracted to each other. Not just attracted, I corrected, consulting another document from the staff. According to this research outline, the consortium wanted to study whether closely related individuals could be manipulated into romantic relationships that would produce offspring with concentrated genetic traits they considered desirable. The implications of what I was saying began to ripple through the crowd like a wave of nausea. Several people moved toward the exits, clearly uncomfortable with witnessing what was becoming less like family drama and more like the exposure of a genetic horror story. The payments to both our families, I continued relentlessly, were specifically designated for actions that would ensure Derek and I would eventually meet and develop a romantic relationship. Every family gathering, every social event, every business partnership between our families, all of it was orchestrated to bring us together. My father stepped forward, his voice hoarse with shock. Victoria, what are you saying? That our friendship with the Hawthorns was fake. Not fake, Dad, I said, my tone gentler when addressing him directly. Engineered. The consortium paid both families to maintain close social ties, to ensure regular contact between the children, and to encourage romantic relationships between specific genetic matches. But while Derek's voice was barely audible, but in the complete silence of the ballroom everyone heard him, I pulled out the final document from the stack, a leather-bound journal with pages covered in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting, because, according to my grandfather's private notes, the consortium believed that controlled breeding between the Sterling and Hawthorne bloodlines would produce children with superior intelligence, enhanced physical capabilities, and what they termed optimized genetic expression. Like breeding horses, Celeste said, her voice filled with revulsion. Exactly like breeding horses, I confirmed. Except the horses in this case were human beings who had no idea they were part of an experiment. Derek sank back into his chair, his entire body shaking. How long has this been going on? According to these records, the consortium has been manipulating Sterling and Hawthorne family relationships for 3 generations, I said, consulting my grandfather's journal. Your grandparents' relationship was the first successful pairing. Your parents' friendship was carefully maintained to ensure continued genetic monitoring. And your relationship with me was the intended culmination of 60 years of genetic planning. But what about Celeste and me? Derek asked, his voice hollow with shock. If they wanted you and me together, why do we feel this way about each other? I smiled for the first time that evening, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. That's where the story gets really interesting, because according to these documents, the consortium didn't account for one crucial variable in their genetic engineering project. I opened my grandfather's journal to a page marked with a red bookmark and began to read aloud. The researchers failed to consider that genetic sexual attraction operates independently of their breeding objectives. Subject DH appears to be responding to subject CS with greater intensity than to intended pairing. Subject is suggesting that biological recognition systems cannot be completely controlled through environmental manipulation. The scientific language made the situation sound even more horrifying. Derek and Celeste weren't just half-cousins who had unknowingly developed inappropriate feelings. They were test subjects in a multi-generational breeding experiment who had developed attractions that contradicted their researchers' intended outcomes. So we're what? Failed experiment. Derek's voice was bitter with betrayal and disgust. You're human beings who were manipulated by people who thought they could control genetic destiny, I said firmly. But you're also proof that human attraction is more complex than any research study could predict or control. I closed the journal and looked around the ballroom at the faces of people who were beginning to understand that what they'd witnessed wasn't just a dramatic love triangle. It was the exposure of a genetic conspiracy that had been operating in their community for decades without their knowledge. The question now, I said, my voice taking on the authority of someone who had just revealed the most significant evidence in a case that would reshape multiple families, is what we're going to do with this information. Derek looked up at me with eyes that were filled with something I'd never seen before, not just betrayal or shock, but the dawning realization that everything he thought he knew about his own life had been carefully constructed by other people for purposes he was only beginning to understand. Victoria, he said, his voice cracking. What happens now? Derek's question hung in the air like a challenge, and I realized that this was the moment where I would define not just the immediate consequences of tonight's revelations, but the entire future trajectory of multiple families who had been living lies for decades. The professional side of my brain began organizing the systematic response that would need to unfold over the coming weeks and months. What happens now, I said, my voice taking on the authoritative tone I used when outlining case strategies for complex legal situations, is that we're going to dismantle this conspiracy piece by piece, starting with the financial mechanisms that have been controlling our families for over 30 years. I reached into my purse and withdrew my phone, speed dialing a number I'd programmed weeks ago. Elena, it's Victoria. Yes, I'm ready to proceed with Phase 2. The federal authorities need to be contacted tomorrow morning, and the forensic accountants should begin tracing the trust fund payments immediately. The crowd stirred uneasily as people began to understand that this wasn't just a family scandal anymore. It was about to become a federal investigation into what appeared to be organized human experimentation conducted without consent across multiple generations. Federal authority. James Hawthorne's voice cracked as he spoke. Victoria, surely we can handle this privately within our families. Miss Hawthorne, I interrupted, ending my call and turning to face him with the expression I reserved for hostile witnesses. What's been done to our families constitutes fraud, conspiracy, and potentially human trafficking under federal law. The payments your family received were obtained through deception, and the genetic monitoring conducted on our children without consent may violate multiple federal statutes regarding medical experimentation. Derek's mother stepped forward, her face pale but determined. You can't destroy both our families over something that happened before any of us were born. Mrs. Hawthorne, I replied, consulting the bank statements I still held. According to these records, your family received payments as recently as last month. This isn't ancient history. It's an ongoing criminal enterprise that was still operating 3 weeks ago. I turned to address the entire crowd, many of whom were now filming openly as they realized they were witnessing the exposure of what would likely become a national news story. The Sterling family is immediately severing all business relationships with the Hawthorne family and any other families who may have been involved in this conspiracy. My father stepped forward, his face a mixture of shock and growing anger as the implications continued to sink in. Victoria, what exactly are you saying we need to do? Dad, I said, my voice softening slightly as I addressed him directly, we need to contact every business partner, every social connection, every family friend who has been part of our lives for the past 30 years. We need to determine who knew about this experiment and who was as much a victim as we were. I pulled out a tablet from my purse and began scrolling through documents that Elena and I had prepared over the past weeks. I've already begun preliminary investigation into the extended network. The consortium wasn't limited to our 2 families. There are at least 6 other family lines that appear to have been involved in similar genetic engineering projects. 6 other families. Celeste's voice was barely a whisper, but the horror in it was unmistakable. The Ashfords, the Whitfields, the Blackstone family, the Riversides, the Montgomery clan, and the Grayson dynasty, I read from my list. All prominent families in our social circle, all recipients of payments from the same trust fund network, all participants in what appears to be a multi-generational breeding program designed to concentrate specific genetic traits. Derek stood up shakily, his face cycling through expressions of betrayal, rage, and sickness. Are you telling me that half the people we know have been part of this experiment? I'm telling you that half the people we know have been either participants or victims in a genetic engineering project that has been operating in plain sight for 60 years, I corrected. The question we need to answer is which category each family falls into. I turned my attention back to the Hawthorne family, who were clustered together near the head table looking like defendants waiting for a verdict. The immediate consequence for your family is that all shared financial arrangements, business partnerships, and social obligations are terminated effective immediately. Derek, I'll need your keys to my apartment, access to any shared accounts to be revoked, and all personal property returned within the week. Derek's face crumpled as he began to understand that the revelation of the conspiracy didn't absolve him of the betrayal he'd committed. Victoria, please, I know I made a terrible mistake tonight, but now that we know the truth about why I felt attracted to Celeste, the truth about genetic sexual attraction doesn't excuse the choices you made, I said firmly. You chose to pursue an affair with my sister rather than discussing your feelings with me. You chose to plan tonight's public humiliation rather than seeking professional help for urges you couldn't understand. The conspiracy explains the source of your attraction, but it doesn't excuse your actions. Celeste stepped forward, tears still streaming down her face. Victoria, I'm so sorry. If I'd known we were related, if I'd understood what was happening. You would have what, Celeste? I asked, my voice taking on the patient tone I used when cross-examining witnesses who were attempting to justify inexcusable behavior. You would have told me about your feelings instead of acting on them behind my back. You would have sought counseling instead of seducing my fiancé. She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to stop her. The genetic connection explains why you felt attracted to Derek, but it doesn't explain why you chose to betray your sister rather than dealing with those feelings appropriately. I turned to address the crowd again, many of whom were now edging toward the exits, as they realized the evening's entertainment had become something much more serious and potentially dangerous for anyone who might be connected to the exposed conspiracy. For those of you who are wondering about your own family's potential involvement, I said loudly enough to stop the exodus, Elena Rodriguez has established a hotline for reporting suspicious family payments, unexplained social connection, or unusual pressure to maintain relationships with specific families. The number will be made available through my law firm's website within 48 hours. My mother, who had been silent throughout the entire revelation, finally stepped forward with an expression of profound sadness. Victoria, what does this mean for our family going forward? It means we start over, Mom, I said, my voice gentling, as I addressed her directly. We build relationships based on genuine connection rather than genetic engineering. We make choices based on our own desires, rather than the manipulation of people who treated us like livestock, and we help other families who have been victims of this conspiracy to understand what was done to them. I began gathering the documents back into the manila envelope, signaling that the public portion of tonight's revelations was coming to an end. The forensic investigation will take months to complete. The legal proceedings will likely take years, but the immediate consequence is that every relationship in our extended social circle needs to be examined to determine whether it was genuine or engineered. Derek made one final attempt to approach me, his face desperate with the need to salvage something from the wreckage of the evening. Victoria, is there any chance that we could? Derek, I said, cutting him off with the finality of someone delivering a verdict that cannot be appealed. You and Celeste are half-cousins who have been manipulated into feeling attraction for each other by people who conducted genetic experiments on your families. You're also 2 people who chose to betray someone they claimed to love, rather than seeking help for feelings they couldn't understand. Those are facts that cannot be changed by apologies or explanations. I turned to face the remaining guests, most of whom were now standing in small clusters, whispering urgently as they processed the implications of what they'd witnessed. The bar will remain open for another hour for anyone who needs time to process this information. However, I would advise everyone to consider carefully what they may have witnessed tonight, and whether they have any information that might be relevant to the federal investigation that will begin tomorrow. As I walked toward the exit, envelope in hand, I could hear the explosion of conversation that erupted behind me. By tomorrow morning, the exposure of the genetic engineering conspiracy would be the subject of every news outlet in the country. By next week, federal investigators would be interviewing everyone who had attended tonight's engagement party. But tonight, I was walking away from the wreckage of my old life and toward the beginning of something entirely different, a life built on truth rather than manipulation, a genuine choice rather than genetic programming, and on the satisfaction of having turned my personal betrayal into the exposure of a conspiracy that had victimized dozens of families for generations. The systematic dismantling of 60 years of lies was just beginning. 3 days after the engagement party disaster, I sat in my office, overlooking downtown Millbrook, surrounded by the evidence that had taken me 6 weeks to compile and verify. What I hadn't revealed to the crowd that night, what I hadn't shared even with Elena Rodriguez until this morning, was the extent to which I had orchestrated the entire confrontation with surgical precision. The truth was that I had known about Derek and Celeste's affair for exactly 8 weeks, not suspected, not worried about, known with absolute certainty, because the private investigator I'd hired hadn't been Elena Rodriguez working on my grandfather's estate. I had hired Elena Rodriguez myself, 2 months before my grandfather's death, when my professional instincts had begun screaming that something was wrong with my family dynamics. The safety deposit box discovery was real, the genetic testing results were absolutely accurate, the conspiracy involving multiple families was documented and verified. But my grandfather hadn't left me those documents as a posthumous revelation. I had found them 3 weeks before he died, when I'd used my forensic genealogy connections to investigate anomalies I'd noticed in our family's financial record. My grandfather, Harold Sterling, hadn't been a victim of the genetic engineering conspiracy. He had been one of its original architects. When I'd confronted him on his deathbed about the documents I'd discovered, he'd made a confession that had shattered everything I thought I knew about my family's moral foundation. The consortium hadn't been manipulating our families from the outside. It had been created by our families with the explicit goal of producing what they considered genetically superior offspring through carefully controlled breeding programs. We thought we were improving the species, he'd whispered during our final conversation, his voice weak but his conviction still strong, creating children with enhanced intelligence, superior physical capabilities, optimized genetic expression. We saw ourselves as pioneers, as visionaries who understood that random breeding was inefficient. The payments to both families hadn't been compensation for unwitting participation. They had been progress payments for active collaboration in a multi-generational breeding experiment that treated human beings like prize livestock. Your grandmother, Catherine, knew about the affair with James Hawthorne Sr., my grandfather had continued, his words coming slowly as morphine clouded his thinking. We arranged it specifically to introduce new genetic material into our bloodline. Your father was the intended result of that pairing. The most horrifying revelation had been that my relationship with Derek hadn't been an accident or even a manipulation. It had been the successful culmination of 60 years of genetic planning. Every family gathering, every social event, every business partnership that had brought us together had been designed with the specific goal of producing offspring that would represent the next phase of their genetic optimization project. You and Derek were supposed to marry and have children, my grandfather had explained, his eyes closing as he struggled with the effort of speech. Children who would carry the concentrated genetic advantages of 3 generations of selective breed, the perfect fusion of Sterling intelligence and Hawthorne physical superiority. But what my grandfather and his co-conspirators hadn't anticipated was that genetic sexual attraction, the biological mechanism that normally prevents inbreeding, would manifest as an attraction between Derek and Celeste that was stronger than his programmed attraction to me. The irony was devastating. Their attempt to control human genetics had been undermined by the very genetic mechanisms they thought they could manipulate. Derek's intense attraction to Celeste wasn't a flaw in their plan, it was proof that nature's safeguards against inbreeding were more powerful than any human engineering project. For 8 weeks, I had watched Derek and Celeste struggle with feelings they couldn't understand, knowing exactly what was causing their attraction and why it felt so irresistible. I had let them believe they were fighting against simple forbidden desire when they were actually battling against biological programming that had been specifically designed to make them feel connected to family members. The engagement party confrontation hadn't been a spontaneous reaction to betrayal, it had been a carefully orchestrated revelation designed to expose the conspiracy in the most public and devastating way possible. I had chosen the venue, selected the guest list, and timed the revelation to ensure maximum impact and minimum possibility of cover-up. Every document I'd pulled from that manila envelope had been strategically ordered to build the case like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. The DNA results, the financial records, the research proposals, my grandfather's journal, all of it had been organized to tell a story that would be impossible to deny or rationalize away. But the most calculated aspect of my response was that I had used Derek and Celeste's public betrayal as the perfect catalyst for exposing their family's criminal conspiracy. Their moment of romantic rebellion had become the trigger for revealing decades of genetic manipulation that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. I had let them humiliate me in front of 250 guests because I needed witnesses. I had allowed them to believe they were destroying my life because I needed their confession to be public and undeniable. I had endured their passionate kiss and triumphant declarations because I needed them to commit fully to their relationship before I revealed why that relationship was genetically impossible. The engagement party hadn't been the night my life fell apart. It had been the night I'd chosen to detonate a bomb that would destroy a conspiracy that had been operating in our community for 60 years. Derek's attraction to me hadn't been genuine love, it had been biological programming designed to make him pursue the woman his family's genetic engineers had selected for him. His rebellion against that programming by choosing Celeste had actually been his first authentic choice in a relationship that had been controlled by other people since before he was born. Celeste's attraction to Derek hadn't been simple sibling rivalry or jealousy of my happiness. It had been her response to genetic recognition signals that her brain had misinterpreted as romantic compatibility when they were actually family identification markers. My own feelings for Derek hadn't been the natural evolution of a childhood friendship. They had been the result of 60 years of social conditioning designed to make me believe that marrying him was my choice when it was actually the fulfillment of a genetic breeding contract signed before I was born. The federal investigation that was beginning today wouldn't just examine financial fraud and conspiracy charges, it would expose a network of families who had been conducting unauthorized human experimentation for 3 generations, treating their own descendants like breeding stock in a program designed to create what they considered genetically superior humans. The most satisfying aspect of my plan was that Derek and Celeste's betrayal had given me the perfect weapon to destroy the people who had manipulated all of our lives. Their moment of authentic feeling, their rebellion against the genetic programming that was supposed to make Derek choose me, had become the key to exposing everyone who had treated human beings like laboratory animals. As I sat in my office reviewing the evidence that would reshape multiple families and potentially send several people to federal prison, I realized that the engagement party had been the most successful case presentation of my career. I had taken personal betrayal and transformed it into public justice. I had used genetic science to expose genetic manipulation. I had turned my moment of greatest vulnerability into my moment of greatest professional triumph. Derek would spend the rest of his life knowing that his attraction to both Celeste and me had been artificially created by people who thought they could control human emotion through strategic breeding. Celeste would spend the rest of her life knowing that her most intense romantic feelings had been the result of biological confusion caused by genetic experimentation. But I would spend the rest of my life knowing that I had exposed a conspiracy that had violated the basic human right to authentic choice in relationships, and that I had done it by turning the conspirators' greatest success into their most complete downfall. The truth behind the truth was that sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying the people who wrong you,
it's using their wrongdoing to expose something much larger and more important than personal betrayal. Though I had to admit, watching Derek and Celeste realize they'd been unknowing participants in a genetic breeding program while they were declaring their irresistible love for each other, that had been pretty satisfying too. 6 months after the engagement party that became known in federal court documents as the Silverhaven genetic conspiracy exposure, I stood in the same courtroom where I'd testified as an expert witness hundreds of times before. But this time, I wasn't just presenting evidence, I was watching the final sentencing phase of the largest genetic fraud case in American legal history. The federal investigation had moved with unprecedented speed once the evidence I'd compiled was turned over to authorities. Within 2 weeks of my engagement party revelation, FBI agents had executed search warrants on 12 family estates, 6 private research facilities, and the offices of a biotech company that had been conducting unauthorized genetic testing on unwitting subjects for decades. The scope of the conspiracy had proven even more extensive than I'd initially discovered. The Sterling Hawthorne Genetic Engineering Project had been just one branch of a national network involving 43 families across 15 states, all participating in what prosecutors termed multi-generational human breeding experiments conducted without informed consent. Derek sat in the defendant's section, though his charges were limited to conspiracy and fraud related to accepting payments while knowing his relationship with me was artificially orchestrated. His cooperation with federal investigators had earned him a plea agreement that would result in probation rather than prison time, but the psychological devastation was written across his face in permanent lines of guilt and confusion.
The truly shocking revelation had come during the investigation's 3rd week, when financial analysts had traced the conspiracy's funding to a pharmaceutical company that had been harvesting genetic data from the orchestrated relationships to develop what they termed enhancement therapies for wealthy clients. The children born from the breeding program weren't just the products of genetic optimization, they were unwitting test subjects whose DNA was being studied and sold to fund research into genetic manipulation technologies. Celeste had been granted immunity in exchange for her testimony about the psychological manipulation tactics used to encourage compliance with the breeding program. Her testimony had revealed that both families had employed child psychologists, relationship counselors, and even social workers who were secretly working to ensure that designated pairings would develop romantic attachments at appropriate ages. They had charts, she'd testified during the trial's most dramatic moment, her voice barely audible as she described discovering documents in our parents' home safe, psychological profiles of all the children, predictions about when we'd reach sexual maturity, strategies for encouraging specific relationships and discouraging others. They tracked our emotional development like scientists monitoring lab rats. The revelation that our childhood experiences had been systematically manipulated to produce desired romantic outcomes had been almost more disturbing than the genetic engineering itself. Every summer camp, every family vacation, every social event had been designed to create emotional bonds that would later be exploited for genetic purposes. Derek's parents had received the harshest sentences, 12 years each for conspiracy, fraud, and violation of federal medical research regulations. They'd been active participants in the conspiracy for over 30 years, accepting payments, not just for maintaining social connections, but for providing detailed reports on their children's physical and emotional development to researchers who were tracking the success of their genetic program. My own parents had received lighter sentences after it was revealed that my father had been as much a victim as a participant. His discovery of his true paternity during the federal investigation had led to a complete psychological breakdown that required months of therapy to address. My mother's involvement had been limited to following social guidance she'd believed was coming from family friends rather than genetic researchers. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal scholars, and representatives from genetic research oversight organizations who were using the case to push for stricter federal regulations on human genetic research. The story had become international news, with documentary crews from 3 countries producing films about what bioethicists were calling the most significant violation of research ethics in modern history. But for me, the most significant aftermath had been personal rather than legal. The revelation that my entire life had been artificially orchestrated had required me to examine every relationship, every decision, every emotional attachment to determine what had been genuine and what had been the result of manipulation. My forensic genealogy business had exploded with new clients after the case became public. Families across the country were requesting genetic analysis to determine whether they'd been victims of similar conspiracy. I'd hired 12 additional staff members and opened offices in 4 other cities to handle the demand from people who wanted to understand their true genetic relationships and identify any artificial manipulation in their family history. The professional satisfaction of helping other families uncover the truth about their relationships had been complicated by the personal difficulty of rebuilding my own life from scratch. Every friendship, every romantic interest, every family connection now required careful analysis to determine whether it was based on genuine affection or the lingering effects of genetic programming. Derek had attempted to contact me multiple times during the investigation, claiming that his feelings for me had been real despite their artificial origin. Even if they programmed us to be attracted to each other, he'd said during one particularly painful phone conversation, that doesn't mean what I felt wasn't genuine. But I'd learned to distinguish between authentic emotion and biological programming, and I'd realized that Derek's attraction to me had never had the desperate, almost compulsive quality that characterized his feelings for Celeste. His love for me had been comfortable, predictable, socially acceptable, exactly what genetic researchers would program into a relationship designed to produce compliant breeding pair. His attraction to Celeste, however, had been chaotic, uncontrollable, and ultimately destructive, exactly what genetic sexual attraction looks like when people don't understand what they're experiencing. Their relationship had imploded within 6 weeks of my engagement party revelation, once they understood that their intense chemistry was the result of biological confusion rather than romantic destiny. Celeste had entered therapy to address what psychologists termed genetic identity disorder, the psychological trauma that occurs when people discover their most intense relationships have been based on biological misunderstanding. She'd moved to Portland and started working with a support group for victims of genetic manipulation, using her experience to help other people who'd discovered that their romantic relationships had been artificially orchestrated. The most unexpected consequence of the investigation had been the discovery that I'd inherited genetic traits that made me particularly suited for forensic work: enhanced pattern recognition, superior memory for detail, and an unusual ability to detect deception. These traits hadn't been accidental. They'd been selectively bred into the Sterling bloodline over 3 generations specifically to produce individuals who could work in law enforcement and legal analysis. Even my career success had been the result of genetic programming designed to create individuals who would be useful to the conspiracy's long-term goal. The researchers had wanted people with investigative skills who could help them monitor their breeding programs and cover up any problems that arose. The irony that my genetically enhanced investigative abilities had been used to expose and destroy the very conspiracy that had created them was not lost on federal prosecutors who'd made my story the centerpiece of their case against genetic manipulation research. As I watched the final defendants receive their sentences, I reflected on the fact that the engagement party disaster had been the beginning of the most professionally successful and personally liberating period of my life. Discovering that my entire existence had been artificially constructed had forced me to rebuild my identity based on authentic choices, rather than genetic program. The federal investigation was closing, but the personal investigation into who I really was, separate from the genetic traits I'd inherited and the psychological manipulation I'd experienced, was just beginning. For the first time in my life, I was free to discover what I actually wanted, who I genuinely cared about, and what choices I would make if no one was programming me to make them. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely unknown, but it was authentically mine. 2 years after the night that began with champagne and betrayal and ended with the exposure of a multi-generational genetic conspiracy, I received an unexpected visitor at my expanded offices in downtown Millbrook. Celeste stood in my waiting room, looking nothing like the woman who had kissed my fiancé in front of 250 guests with triumph blazing in her eyes. The platinum blonde hair was gone, replaced by her natural auburn color that I hadn't seen since we were children. The designer clothes had been traded for simple jeans and a volunteer t-shirt from the Portland Genetic Victims Support Network. Most significantly, the desperate need for attention that had defined her personality for 26 years had been replaced by something I'd never seen in her before. Genuine peace. "I know you probably don't want to see me," she said when my assistant showed her into my office, "but I needed to tell you something important before I lose my courage." I gestured to the chair across from my desk, the same chair where I'd sat with hundreds of clients as they processed devastating revelations about their family connections. "What brings you back to Silverhaven, Celeste?" "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice steady in a way it had never been during our childhood or the months leading up to my engagement party, "for destroying my life in the most compassionate way possible." The statement was so unexpected that I actually laughed. "That's definitely a first. Most people don't thank me for ruining their relationships and exposing their families as criminal conspirators." "You didn't ruin my relationship with Derek," she said with a slight smile. "You saved me from a relationship that was based on genetic confusion rather than authentic connection. And you didn't expose our family as criminals. You exposed the people who had been treating our family like experimental animals for 60 years." She pulled out a manila folder that looked remarkably similar to the one I'd carried to my engagement party 2 years earlier. "I've been working with genetic counselors and trauma therapists for the past 18 months, trying to understand what happened to us and how to build authentic relationships after a lifetime of manipulation." I asked, genuinely curious about her journey towards psychological recovery. "It's been the hardest thing I've ever done," she admitted. "Learning to distinguish between programmed responses and genuine emotions, figuring out which personality traits are actually mine versus which ones were encouraged by people who wanted me to be a certain way. But it's also been the most liberating experience of my life." She opened the folder and pulled out a document that I recognized immediately, a genetic counseling report with detailed analysis of family relationship patterns. "I wanted to show you something that my therapist helped me understand about what really happened that night at your engagement party." "What did you discover?" "That my attraction to Derek wasn't just genetic sexual attraction responding to family DNA," she said, consulting the report. "According to the psychological analysis, I was also responding to conditioning that had been programmed into me since childhood to seek validation through competitive behavior with you specific." The revelation was fascinating from a professional standpoint, though personally devastating in its implications. "Meaning what?" "Exactly. Meaning that the conspiracy didn't just engineer romantic attractions between designated breeding pairs," she explained. "They also engineered sibling rivalry patterns designed to ensure that if the primary pairing failed, secondary options would be available. They programmed me to compete with you for male attention as a backup strategy for keeping the genetic lines connected." I stared at her as the full horror of what she was describing sank in. "You're saying they deliberately created a dynamic where you would try to steal my romantic partner?" "I'm saying they trained me from childhood to see your happiness as a threat to my own survival," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of understanding that had clearly taken months of therapy to achieve. "Every time you succeeded at something, I was conditioned to feel like I needed to take something away from you to restore balance. They turned sibling love into competitive warfare." The professional side of my brain was already analyzing the implications for other families who'd been victims of the conspiracy. "Have you shared this analysis with the federal investigators?" "I testified about it 3 months ago," she said. "It's being used to develop new protocols for identifying and treating victims of genetic manipulation programming." Apparently, engineered sibling rivalry was a common feature in most of the breeding program. We sat in silence for a moment as I processed the fact that even our childhood conflicts had been artificially created by people who thought they could control human emotion through strategic psychological manipulation. "There's something else," Celeste continued, pulling out a second document. "I wanted to give you this." It was a formal apology letter, but not the kind of emotional plea I might have expected. Instead, it was a carefully researched document that acknowledged the specific ways her behavior had violated my trust, analyzed the psychological programming that had influenced her choices, and outlined the steps she was taking to ensure she would never again allow manipulation to override her authentic moral judgment. "This is remarkably thorough," I said, scanning the 3-page analysis that read more like a legal brief than a personal apology. "I learned from watching you handle the engagement party revelation," she said with a rueful smile. "You taught me that emotional responses are less effective than systematic analysis backed by documented evidence. And what does your systematic analysis conclude about our relationship going forward?" She took a deep breath before answering. that we should start over as adults who understand what was done to us, rather than trying to repair a sibling relationship that was artificially constructed by people who treated us like breeding stock. The suggestion was both practical and heartbreaking. What would that look like? Coffee sometime, maybe. Conversations about who we actually are when we're not responding to genetic programming or psychological conditioning. Discovering whether we genuinely like each other as people rather than assuming we should love each other because we share DNA. It was the most mature suggestion Celeste had ever made, and I realized that the woman sitting across from me bore little resemblance to the sister who had destroyed my engagement party in pursuit of validation she'd been programmed to seek. "I'd like that," I said, meaning it completely. Though I should warn you that I'm still figuring out who I am when I'm not responding to genetic enhancement programming designed to make me good at investigative work. "Are you happy with what you're discovering?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. Over the past 2 years, I'd deliberately avoided romantic relationships while I learned to distinguish between authentic attraction and the residual effects of genetic programming. I'd traveled extensively, pursuing interests that had nothing to do with my enhanced investigative ability. I'd learned to paint, studied philosophy, taken cooking classes, and discovered a passion for historical research that was completely separate from my forensic genealogy work. I'm discovering that I actually enjoy helping people understand their true family connections, not because I was genetically programmed to be good at it, but because there's something deeply satisfying about revealing truth that sets people free from manipulation. Because devastating truth is still preferable to beautiful lies that control your entire life. Celeste nodded as if my answer confirmed something she'd hoped to hear. "I'm glad you feel that way, because I have one more revelation that you need to know about." She pulled out a final document, this one bearing the letterhead of the Portland Genetic Victims Support Network. "We've been contacted by families in 6 other countries who've discovered similar genetic engineering conspiracies in their community. They're asking for help from someone with experience in exposing these programs. And you're telling me this because they specifically requested Victoria Sterling, the forensic genealogist who turned her own family tragedy into the destruction of an international conspiracy," she said with something that looked like pride. "They want to hire you to help them expose genetic manipulation programs that are still operating in their community." The opportunity was exactly the kind of work I'd discovered I was passionate about, using my genuinely chosen skills to help other people escape from the kind of manipulation that had controlled my own life for 29. "I'll consider it," I said, though I was already mentally planning how to expand my practice to handle international genetic conspiracy cases. "Victoria," Celeste said as she stood to leave, "I know this sounds strange, but I think that engagement party disaster was the best thing that ever happened to both of us." I smiled, thinking about how that night had transformed from the worst betrayal of my life into the catalyst for the most meaningful work I'd ever done. "You know what, Celeste? I think you might be right." As I watched my sister walk away, not the sister who'd been programmed to compete with me, but the woman who'd chosen to rebuild her life based on authentic values, I realized that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't forgiveness. Sometimes it's the truth that destroys everything they thought they wanted and forces them to discover who they really are. The engagement party had ended with broken relationships and exposed, but it had begun something far more valuable: the possibility of authentic connections built on truth rather than genetic programming, genuine choice rather than biological manipulation, and real love rather than the artificial attraction engineered by people who thought they could control the human heart. Looking back, I should thank Derek and Celeste for their betrayal. Without it, I might never have discovered that the most devastating revelations can become the foundation for the most meaningful transformations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.